Hello everybody, welcome to CIS278. I am Bob Hendry, and today is Wednesday, the 16th of October, 2019. So first of all, I sound a little bit differently than I used to sound, or I sound a little bit different than I usually sound, because my microphone's broken. So I'm using a microphone that's a little bit of a lower quality, so I probably sound a little bit tinny. So keep that in mind when I go to the screen demo portion of this, that I recorded it with a different microphone, so I sound slightly different, just in case you notice. Now, in today's lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to continue our study of triggers. So we're going to continue basically where we left off in the last lecture. So I titled this lecture Triggers Part 2 because it's really a continuation of what we've already been doing. So we're going to continue with triggers and go over some more code examples. And our goal for today, for the end of class, for the end of this lecture, is to get a better understanding on how Oracle triggers work and some more uses that we can imply where we can apply to triggers, such as enforcing business rules. We can also short circuit the SQL statement that's running in the trigger, and we can do things such as validate data, or we can change values that are entered as part of a SQL statement before it actually gets to the database. So we're going to go over examples for the next 40 or 50 minutes or so, and again, by the end of the unit you should know more about triggers. So let's get started.
Okay, the first thing we're going to do is let's go over the code examples that we're going to be covering. Pardon me. To support our class and this video, we're going to be using two tables. We're going to be using a table called cust, which you see here. Again, there's nothing really remarkable about this table. We're just dropping it and creating it. Notice that we're keeping things simple here. I don't have anything insofar as any constraints on my table. So I just have a customer number, I got a name, an address, a balance, and a occur date. And notice I'm using fairly simple data types. I'm using just numbers, variable characters, and again for balance I have a number, and current date I have a date. And just on purpose, what I'm doing is I'm leaving these tables very, very simple to kind of abstract any complexity out of this, just to show you that there are indeed simple tables, that we're not doing anything as constraints go, such as primary keys, check constraints, foreign keys, just plain Jane tables. And again, just on a coincidence, I have the same here for audit cost. Now, again, it's just a coincidence that the table structure is the same. It doesn't have to be, but we're just using it just to keep it simple. Again, I'm trying to keep the tables, out of the way, if you would, so we could just use the tables as part of the lab environment. So if you want to follow along, if you can build these tables, that would be great. If you already have them, that would be great. If you get this video, you probably have a link there to actually download the code, or you could email me and I could give you the code to build these tables, and then you could just run this as a script to do so. But I already have these tables in my lab environment, which we're going to be using shortly. Now, the lab environment that we're going to be using is SQL Express for Oracle. So let's take a look at what we see there. So let me kind of navigate down to that script. Let me close some things up here. So anyway, not that script, but the environment. So we have here, we got SQL script, SQL commands. We have basically our Oracle Apex environment. So let's see what we have in those two tables. So I'm going to quickly go into SQL commands and just take a look at what I have in those two tables. We have cust and we have audit cust. So I'm just going to do a quick select star from cust, and then we'll look at the customer table and just note that we have two records in there. We have Bob and we have Cassie, and then we got their addresses. Again, just two records, nothing really to see here. Now let's also take a look at the table that we have audit cust. So we'll do a select star from audit cust, And here we're going to see, again, that we got a couple records in here as well. So for the purpose of our labs, we can kind of possibly just ignore the data that's in both of these tables and kind of start with some new ones. Now let's talk a little bit more about triggers. Now what a trigger is a trigger, pardon me, say that 10 times fast after a few martinis for lunch, right? Now what a trigger is a piece of database code that gets executed upon some sort of action to a table. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using for our test table, or our table that we're going to be putting the trigger on, is we're going to be using the cust table. So if I do a select star from cust, you're going to notice, again, I got a couple records in there. But let's talk about what could happen to this table. Now, there are 3 different types of SQL statements that can be executed on this table, right? Well, 4 if you include select. But let's talk about the SQL that can occur on this table that would do things such as alter the data. So there's only really 3 clauses, SQL clauses, that are possible, right? You have update, which will update a column in this table. You have delete, and a delete presumably will delete 1 record or potentially more than 1 record of data from this table. And then we have, what did I forget? And then we have insert. Now insert will insert a record, which is still changing the table. So we have 3 different SQL statements that will change the data in this table. SQL insert, SQL delete, and a SQL update. And forget about select for now. Select, yes, it's a SQL statement. It'll grab data from the table, but it does nothing insofar as changing any of the data. So what do we do? Now, in our case, if we want to perform some kind of action upon this table changing, such as an insert, an update, or a delete, what we can do is we can install or attach, they're the same thing, they're synonymous with each other, a trigger on the table. Now again, what that means is what we're going to do is we're going to put some code on the table that's going to execute upon a SQL insert, update, or delete. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, you can go your entire life and your entire database career and not worry about any of this foolishness. You can say, you know what, we're not using triggers at all. And certainly you'd be fine. But you may find that there's certain things that you may want to do every time something is changed within a table. For example, if we change the address or the balance for a customer that we see here, we may want to keep track of the change, in another table somewhere, like audit cust or cust changes or something. We may want to put a trigger on the cust table that keeps track of these changes. Or we may want to have some sort of data cleansing. For example, how about the scenario where, how about we have a rule that we can't update a customer balance to be more than $1 million for whatever reason. What we can do is we could put a trigger on the table to enforce that, to say, you know what, if someone tries to insert or update something that's more than $1 million, how about this, make it $1 million? Just say it could only be a maximum of $1 million, and if it's more than that, make it $1 million. Or how about this, balances can't be less than 0. And if a balance attempts to be less than 0, make it 0. We can also do things such as enforce security. For example, we could put in row level security or column level security that names and addresses may not be modified if a balance is maybe greater than 10,000. Or if the balance is less than 10,000, we're allowed to change the name and the addresses. So what triggers allow us to do from a high level is they allow us to put in some business rules that we want to apply every time something is attempting to change our data, either via an insert statement, an update statement, or a delete statement. Now, what you do in the trigger really is completely up to you. So in this short class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 different ways that we can implement triggers. So let me go and pan to the code examples. And what I will do is if you contact me somehow, I will give you the code to put these triggers in so you don't got to actually code them, one at a time or like one line at a time. So I called these guys trigger 3 and trigger 4. Forget trigger 1 and trigger 2. They were used somewhere else. You're not going to see them here. So we're going to see trigger 3 and trigger 4. Let's take a look at trigger number 3. And again, I'll put in some long pauses in here so you can catch up if you like. But trigger 3 is going to be a trigger that's going to enforce a couple of different business rules. So I'll let you look at that for a second. I'll give you about 10-15 seconds of dead air, and I'll continue. And also, when I leave dead air here in situations like this, that's your cue to pause the video if you like, and then you can continue when you get a inkling of how this code works. So let me give you some dead air to pause the video if you'd like to. Okay, so let's review what this code segment does here. We have the code to drop the trigger. Again, we name this cust name upper. So what this does is what we're doing here is just dropping a trigger called cust name upper, and then what we're doing is we're basically building the table out. Now, what we're doing here is we're doing some sort of data manipulation, or data which a lot of times is called massaging. So basically what's happening here is when we're inserting or updating the name on the customer table, again, this is important. So this is going to be fired on an insert statement or an update statement. So basically what we're doing here is if we're inserting or updating, inserting a record or updating the name of the customer table, what we're doing here is a couple of things. The first thing that we're doing is we're taking the name that we get via the new bind variable. We're getting the name from the again from the insert of the update statement, and then what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, we're getting the name and we're converting it all to uppercase characters. So again, this would be the rule, such as in the customer table, the name has to be in uppercase. Now, a trigger is a good place to enforce this because we can fix the data if we need to without necessarily putting a constraint on the customer or on the name column in the customer table. Like, for example, we could have put a constraint on here that if the name is not in uppercase characters, just to reject it. But we're not doing that here. What we chose to do in this code example from a design perspective is to put a trigger on the actual table. So what the trigger is doing is the trigger is saying, all right, rather than failing if the name isn't in uppercase, let's just quietly make it in uppercase and not make a big fuss about it. In English, meaning don't fail the SQL statement or throw an exception, but just quietly fix the data if you can. And that's what we're doing from a high level architecture for this trigger. We're saying basically in this line of code, if the name that we're trying to insert or update is not in uppercase, just make it in uppercase. And again, since triggers are fired silently, which meaning that we don't specify, okay, trigger run, and it doesn't say I've started or I've ended, we can put that functionality in a trigger because it's something that we might want to do every time that an update or an insert statement runs on the customer table. We want to quietly just take a look at what the name is, and then if it's not in uppercase characters, we make it in uppercase characters. And then we have another rule here that we're saying, all right, let's look at the balance that we're actually updating or inserting. If the balance is less than 1,000, what we're doing is we're making it 1,000. Why? Well, it's our trigger. We could do what we want to. So basically what we're doing with this trigger is we're using this trigger to enforce business rules. Business rules being business rule 1, if the name is not in uppercase characters, make it in uppercase characters. And make no, as I'll say, use a slang term, just make no more fuss about it. Don't throw an exception. Allow the update statement to continue and just quietly make the name in uppercase characters. Then what we're saying is we have another rule, taking a look at the balance. If the balance is less than 1,000, we make it 1,000. Now we could have implemented this as a constraint maybe, but here what we're doing is we're putting some business logic in as a trigger. Pardon me, I should have a cough or a burp button, huh? If the balance is less than 1,000, just make it 1,000. So you're getting to see from an architecture standpoint some of the things that we use triggers for. And again, what we're doing for here, or using a trigger for here, is we're enforcing two business rules. Also, take a look at this as we can put the trigger, again, this is an important line of code that I've highlighted, before or after the update statement or the insert statement fires on a specific column in the customer table. What we're going to do for grins is I'm going to get rid of this of name. So we're going to fire this if anything gets updated, not just the name. Okay, so we have this is trigger 3. That's just a comment. Let me copy this code and paste it into Apex and run this as a database script. And I will do that here. I will go to SQL Workshop, SQL Commands. I will build a database script. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use a script I already have called build trigger. Actually, no, I'll leave that. Let me build a new one. Sorry. I kind of corrected myself there. Let me build a new script. So I paste in my code, and I'll give you a chance to do the same. And when you're done, I'm going to call this SC, and I'm going to say biz rule trigger. I'll give you a second to get this working, or to actually get this compiled. And hold on, let me go back to show you what it looks like. I'll give you a second. Now, this should just compile fine when we're ready. We haven't done so yet, but as long as you have the cust table there, we should be good. But I'll give you a second to make sure that you have the cust table there. If not, like I said, you can contact me if you don't got the code for the cust table, and I'll be glad to give it to you. Let me give you one more second, and we're going to run this to compile the trigger and build the trigger. All right, so now let me run this script to build the trigger. Remember, building the trigger doesn't execute it. It just compiles it and it gets it ready to go. The trigger is going to be fired upon an insert statement or an update. So let me run the trigger to make sure it compiles okay. So I'm not running it, I'm compiling it. And I'm looking at my message bar here. It says waiting for Apex. We're going to wait for it to compile. So I'm not locked up, I'm just waiting. I didn't know that my trigger took this long to compile, but we'll give it a shot. There we go. And we got a bit of an issue here where it doesn't like cust name upper. So let me run this again just to make sure we got this in the right order. Let me go to edit script. Looks like it executed these in the wrong order. It should do the drop first. Let me do this again. It should drop the trigger, then create it. And we're good. It just looks like it executed in the wrong order. You're going to see that. And again, let's kind of go off on a little bit of a side trip here, a little bit of a field trip. Sometimes, if you have multiple different lines in a SQL script, if Apex is busy, once in a great while, it'll execute them out of order. If it does, just look at this and make sure it executes them in the correct order. And as I famously say, and nobody will get hurt. We're good. All right, so we got the trigger. That's going to be fired before the insert of the update. So let's see the trigger in action. I'm going to go and update a record. How about this? We go to SQL Scripts, navigate up all the way to SQL Commands, and we're going to update a record. Let me do the following. Let's do a select star from cust. All right, so we got two different records here. We have Bob and Cassie. So let's update Bob's balance. Let's take a look at the trigger and see what the rule is again. Now we have a rule here that if we try to update a balance to be less than 1,000, we make it 1,000. Why? Because the trigger says so. It's our trigger. We can do what we want. All right, so let's do how about this? Let's update balance, update cust, set balance equal 0, where custno is equal to 1. So what we're doing here is we're trying to set Bob's balance to 1. To 0. You would have caught that though. Update cust, set balance equals 0, where cust number equals 1. So basically we're trying to make this into 0. So we click on run to run our SQL statement. Our SQL statement runs, and when we look at our data, I'll select star from cust. We get to look at our data, and we should notice that Bob's balance is 1,000. Well, why is it 1,000? Well, it's 1,000 because what we did is we tried to set it to 0, and our trigger says we can't set it to 0. Let's make it 1,000. And also, kind of as a side trick to this, the Bob became uppercase here. Even though we didn't update it, what's happening is it took the Bob and made it uppercase. But let's try that. Let's try to put a new record in here. Let's do an insert into cust values, and we'll put in, how about customer number 3, and the name is, we are going to put in Mike Jordan. Got to be like Mike, right? Address, we'll put 123 Main Street, and we'll make Mike's balance 0, and we'll put, how about sysdate for the current date. And if you don't know what sysdate is just the current date of the system as far as the date timestamp goes. So we got insert in the cust, values. We got 3 Mike Jordan, 123 Main Street, his balance is 0, and sysdate. So I'm going to pause the video metaphorically, right? Because you're going to actually pause it, not me. I'm not actually watching a video. I'm doing this live, so I really can't pause myself. But when I insert this, what is this record going to look like? Well, let's take a look. First of all, the trigger is going to be fired, right? Because we're doing an insert on the cust table. And first thing it's going to do, well, it's going to evaluate. It's going to say, do we have an insert or an update on the cust table? And we do. What it's going to do is it's going to take the name, converted all the uppercase characters, then it's going to look at the balance. And if the balance is less than 0, it's going to make it, less than 1,000, it's going to make it 1,000. And again, triggers fire silently. Nothing indicates that this happens. And that's kind of the point, where triggers quietly just, in this case, just fix the data. And that's how they work. So if I go and take a look at my code or my SQL statement, I'm inserting in the cust values 3 Mike Jordan, 123 Main Street, 0 sysdate. So I click on run. 1 row inserted. Now if I take a look at the customer table, like select star from cust, notice Mike Jordan is in all uppercase because the trigger made him in all uppercase and made the balance 1,000. So this trigger fired and successfully, as far as we're concerned, changed the name to uppercase and the balance equal to 1,000. Let me give you a minute to do a pause if you want to pause the video and run that again. All right, so let's look at some other things that we can do with the trigger. So we use the trigger there to enforce a couple of business rules. We can also do things such as stop processing. For example, let's just say we have an update, an insert, or a delete that we want to stop. Like, for example, how about we have a rule that balances cannot be, like right here, we have a rule that if a balance is less than 1,000, make it 1,000. How about this? If we could take it a step further in this example and say if the balance is less than 0, just don't even execute the SQL statement. Don't modify the balance. Just stop it. You see this type of trigger in a lot of database security applications where you might look at certain things on the system that aren't allowed to happen. How about this? Deletes aren't allowed on the customer table. And let's just say we have a rule that we don't really delete customers, we just make them inactive. So therefore, if a delete was to be executed on the customer table, we would consider that suspicious. Or how about something else suspicious? We don't update balances to less than 0, or we don't update balances more than $1 million. Anything outside of that range would be considered suspicious. Or we might have something like we don't allow raises or balances to be changed to more than 5% of what they currently are. In those instances, what we can do is we can use a trigger to catch those suspicious activities and perhaps create some logging information, or even more to stop the execution of the actual SQL, saying don't do it, don't execute this insert, this update, or delete, and we can use a trigger to do so. So let's look at some code that does that. So let's look at our code examples. And again, I got an example here that said that we have for trigger 4. And again, for here we got pos cust bail. So we got a trigger here before insert or update on cust. So what happens here is this trigger is going to fire on the customer table for every insert or update. And we have an exception declared here. If you don't know what exceptions are, you can look them up. But here we have a different block, and we're declaring an exception. Now, again, exceptions, if you're unfamiliar with them, it's the subject of it's a different subject covered primarily beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But exceptions are system errors, and we can do things such as assign them numbers and functionality. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the balance. Now, if the balance is less than 0, what we're doing here is we're raising an error. Raise is basically throwing an exception or saying that there's a system error message that has occurred. When that happens, processing falls to the exception block. And in the exception block, what I'm doing here is I have a trigger that's saying if we have a neg bal error, which means that the balance here is less than 0, what we're doing is I'm calling the function raise application error, and there I'm giving it a number. Again, anything in the range of negative 2001 to negative, I think, 2100 are error messages that we're allowed to use in Oracle, and then some text. Anytime that you raise an application error in a trigger, what happens is this automatically stops the execution of the SQL statement. In English, it says don't continue. If you're inserting a record, don't do it. If you're updating a record, don't do it. It short circuits it. It just says don't allow this to happen. So basically, we have a trigger here that would be used in as part of an overall database security sort of architecture. Well, what we're saying here is if for some reason there's an insert or an update statement on the customer table coming from anywhere, it doesn't matter if it's from someone's code, if it's a web application, if someone logs in and is trying to execute the SQL, anywhere in the world, if there's an update or an insert statement that is executed in our customer table, if for any reason that statement is trying to get our balance less than 0, don't do it. What we would do as part of database security administrators, if we could put on our database security administration hat for a second, is we probably would have dozens of these triggers on our database management system, on our on our tables. So what we would do is like we'd say, oh, you know what? We would identify, you know, a couple dozens of things that we would consider suspicious, and we would want to literally short circuit the SQL from actually executing. And presumably this would be one of them. So here what we're doing is we're saying, you know what? If we have an opportunity, or if we have the situation where we have a SQL statement that's updating something less than 0, don't do it. So let's compile this trigger and see if it works. So let's go back to SQL commands. And from SQL commands, go into SQL scripts, and let me build a new script. I'm going to say new or create. There's me. And you've already seen this code. I copied and pasted it in. I'll call this script SC, and I'll say prevent SQL. Now remember, this is just the script name. We can call this anything we want. We're saving the script. It's not the trigger name. The trigger name is here called pos_cust_bail. So this is just a script name that we're using just to kind of compile this. So let me compile the trigger. Make sure we get no errors, and we shouldn't because it's been pre-tested by me. And this is fine. It's just saying we can't drop it because it doesn't exist. And then it creates it. So we're okay. So we have the trigger. So now we can test it. So let's go to the customer table. So let's go to SQL scripts. And from SQL scripts, we'll navigate up one more and then go to SQL commands. So let's look to see what we have in the customer table by doing a select star from cust. So let's do the following. Let's make Cassie's balance less than 0. The trigger should fire. So if I say update, how about this balance? And we'll say, update cust. And let's do set balance equal -100 or 1000, where, and we'll say cust no is equal to 2. And we don't need the semicolon. Pardon me. I really do not like these notifications. All right, update cust, set balance equal -1000, where cust no is equal to -2. So let's run the SQL statement. And take a look at this. This looks like an error message, like, oh my gosh, it's broken. But no, this is ours. This is our functionality and our messages. Remember I said in a statement early in this video that triggers run silently, and they do, unless we raise an exception. And then we're going to get these error messages. Again, these are ours. Aura, -2001. Negative not allowed. And it says the error was in the execution of the trigger, and it shows the update statement. It says update set balance equals -1000, where cust no equals 2. So this isn't really an error. It's a good error. I mean, well, it is an error. Let's take a step back. It's an error, but it's an error that we actually said that we want to introduce. We're saying it's an error. SQL wouldn't mind this. It's just saying, well, if you want to update the customer balance to -1000, there's no check constraint that says that we can't do it. But we being the database developer, has a trigger that says don't allow this. So we, as part of the trigger, said consider this an execution error. So when you say error during execution, that is us. That is us raising the exception in the trigger. So this is working as expected, working as advertised. This is BOU, business, or BAU, business as usual. This is something that we expect to happen. So anyway, and we could see now that if we looked at Cassie, that her balance hasn't changed. Why? Because we raised the exception in the trigger, and that prevents that SQL from running, that SQL update from running. So if we said, select star from cust, and then run, notice Cassie's balance has not changed. So we're all good. So that trigger prevented that change from happening. Again, that's a great example of how to use triggers to enforce database security. In this case, we identified something that was suspicious prior to something bad happening, and we put a trigger in to prevent that. So if you're putting together a data protection or a data security strategy, triggers are a big part of that. Because what you could say is like, you know what, let's put triggers in to keep track of the changes that are being made. And also we can keep track of, prevent harmful or suspicious SQL form statements from even being executed. And we did that. We protected our data by saying, you know what, we don't like this SQL. In a regular environment, balances never, ever, 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 pinky swear, pinky swear, pinky swear, should never be less than 0. So rather than keeping track of the SQL, we just prevented it, saying don't allow that SQL to happen. All right, let's review a couple things that we did, and we're going to wrap this up. So we went over the tables that we built. Again, we just have the cust table and the audit cust, which we really didn't use in this example, but we have the code for it here. But we have the customer table, so you have the code to build it there, and we went over 2 triggers. The first trigger, which we have, this is trigger 3, was used just to enforce business rules. Again, quietly, just make sure that the name is all in uppercase characters. Again, no big whoop, no big fuss. If it's not in uppercase characters, it's not an error. Just put it in uppercase characters and get on with your life. And we're doing the same with the balance. If the balance is less than 1,000, just make it 1,000. Now, the second one was a little bit more dramatic. Where trigger number 4 is more dramatic, where we're saying, you know, if the balance is less than 0, don't change it to something. Just don't allow that SQL to continue. Hey, you stop. Don't do this. That's why we're executing this trigger before an insert or update, because it gives us a chance to say, you know what, we're being fired from an insert or an update statement. Stop it. Short circuit it. Cut it out. Don't execute it. Why? Because we're raising an error and we're raising an exception error. That basically says just don't do it. Stop it. So we have 2 different uses of a trigger here. Enforcing business rules, and then the second one, enforcing database security to catch suspicious activity before it happens and not allow that to occur. So that is the lecture and the class that we have on some intermediate uses of triggers, maybe beginning uses of triggers / intermediate uses of triggers, and how we could get triggers to run. So in this video, we used a test table called cust. We learned how to compile a trigger, how to save it as a database script, how to make sure that it actually compiles correctly, and then we saw the 2 triggers in action. The one trigger we saw enforcing business rules, where it made Mike Jordan all capital and changed his balance to 1,000 because we tried to make his balance 0. And also, we had a scenario where we saw the second trigger in action, where we tried to update a customer, and in this case Cassie, and we tried to give her a negative balance. And then the trigger fired and said, no way, don't do that. So hopefully you found this useful. I bid you all a very well rest of the day, and thank you for watching.